about something he was going to make a film about. About a topic he was going to make a film about. I mean, when he was about to make Barry Lyndon, he just gorged himself on information about the 18th century. And based on what people who worked with him say, he did the same thing with this film about nuclear war. And I mean some very weighty stuff. He wasn't just reading novels. He was reading doctrine material. He was reading technical material. And he really went into this with the intention to make a serious dramatic film. And I think it's interesting, and again, an important decision of his to make it into a black comedy, because I think it doesn't indicate how lightly he took the topic, but how seriously he took the topic. That his intention was to create a film which was a wake-up call to the world about the danger of nuclear holocaust. And I think he felt the most effective way to do it was to make this kind of film. And in fact, he actually filed a suit to delay the opening of the film Failsafe with Henry Fonda, which was about the identical topic. And indeed, Failsafe was much less of a popular or commercial success than this film. So from that regard, as somebody recently said about Quentin Tarantino, he harnessed the schlock film genre in order to make a serious statement about racism and slavery. And I think the same can be said about Kubrick. He harnessed black comedy to make a serious statement about the dangers of nuclear war.
I was talking with Barry Steelman a little before this movie as to when it came out. You mentioned 1962.
But it was wrong, George. It was actually 64, and I misspoke earlier.
Just after the Kennedy assassination,
right,
which was just after the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Right. And in fact, it was originally going to be released in January or rather, it was originally going to be released in December of '63. And because of the Kennedy assassination, they delayed it.
The credits that you read, it says 1963 in Roman numerals. So.
Yeah. Well, and they also changed the line of dialogue. If you could read lips, when Slim Pickens is going through the survival kit with the condoms and the lipstick and the nylon stockings and the 100 rubles and $100 in gold, and he says a fellow could have a great weekend in Vegas with this. He originally said in Dallas. And they had him redub it because they felt that was too raw because obviously Kennedy had been shot.
One of the characters mentioned the RAND Corporation, which was like the leading one of the leading think tanks, not the only one, in the MAD, Mutual Assured Destruction. So anyway. So that's kind of indicative to me of the fact that Kubrick did delve into the actual situation. Did investigate it.
The military aspect of it is believable, very believable, with the exception of the stuff that's often censored.
Yeah. Well, what's interesting is that they actually almost stopped production because the military thought that they had glommed onto top secret information about. The art director, Adam, actually constructed the interior. They got a photograph of a cockpit from, I forget, some book, cover of a book. And then he basically made from his imagination the interior, but it was so close to being accurate. And this film was made without the cooperation of the U.S. military, but it was so close to being accurate that the military thought that they had breached security.
Where did they get all the plane footage from then? If there's
it's a model plane, and they sent a film crew in an old World War II, not so old then, B-17, to shoot footage over Antarctica or up in the, over Canada and Alaska. And then they just married the model of the B-52.
Didn't marry the shadow very well, though.
Yeah, but I appreciated the effort when I was like, well, they're trying, I want to, just a brief response to what he said earlier, just sparked a memory. In 1986, I was a senior in college, and I remember very distinctly a conversation I had with one of my professors, because I worried a lot about nuclear war at that time, and I asked him, I said, is this just my generation's thing to worry about? Does every generation have something like this? They just have to deal with it and get through it. thinking about, prior wars that we had, and he said, no, this is really scary, this is the real deal. This isn't gonna, he, was very concerned about it at that point too. This must have been, before stuff started to calm down a little. But I think it's a great point. I'm not sure, I thought, I've seen this before but didn't really absorb much of it. Probably watched it at midnight or something on a weekend, and am really impressed by the comedy of it, but it, as you were saying, gets that point across, and remembering how serious a time that was. And I think we've really lost sight of that over the last 30 years. So.
I don't recall it being so funny when I first saw it.
Really? Not funny?
Well, not as funny as it is today. Back then there was more seriousness to it.
Well, one thing that occurred to me is that when this was released, people might not have laughed as much over the idea of the communists poisoning us with fluoride, because that was such a common belief in the right wing. I mean, that was if you don't realize it, that was actually one of the things that organizations like the John Birch Society promulgated, that fluoridation of water was actually a secret communist plot to poison our children and poison us and weaken us. Now, today it seems ludicrous, and there are things that people are saying today that will seem ludicrous 20 years from now, but it's true.
I mean, this movie with On the Beach and Failsafe kind of bookmark that period. And then the made-for-TV movie The Day After, and then the movie Testament kind of came in when The View said, in the 50s, 60s, we had this perspective, and then I think the TV movie, The Day After, just said, this is what could really happen. That caught people's attention, and then the sleeper movie, Testament, came across, and that's when things started moving. We still have this potential threat, but that's when it seemed to move things forward. Move the arms treaties forward, start ramping down the rhetoric, and start dealing with some of these issues.
There's always a question of how well films age, and some of those films that you mentioned, I think, are more rooted in their times.
Right.
They don't play as well, but I think this one is just
Oh
as
yeah,
fresh.
I mean, this is a classic.
And this is, and it absolutely inspired.
Yeah.
And it's still fresh. Plays extremely well, plays fast, it's engaging, it has all the qualities of a feature film.
It does. And one of the things that I noted was, again, the use of the voiceover in the beginning to kind of set, which we saw used extensively, probably too much in The Killing, but which then crops up again in Barry Lyndon and what else? I can't remember the other films in which you might have used it. Maybe did you use that in Lolita? I don't recall. But one of the things that I noted that was different from most Kubrick films is I don't think you see as much camera movement in this film. And that may very well because it's really only shot in 4 locations. Ripper's office, Ripper's base, the war room, and the B-52. Those are the only 4 sets in it, other than the refueling shot at the beginning.
I think the technical wizardry that he showed in the editing in The Killing, I think largely, some of that was done, I mean not largely, but some of that was done in order to show that he was a force to be reckoned with. There's none of that temporal displacement. I mean, it follows, it flows, it's cohesive. It's not as jarring as the sequencing was in The Killing.
Yeah, it's very paced, and but a great use of close-ups in this film.
Yeah.
I mean, the close-ups of Sterling Hayden's face, when he's going through his monologues, or of Dr. Strangelove struggling with his hand,
Which is parodied at least in 3 different movies.
Yeah.
It's been parodied in at least 3 different movies.
Well,
I mean,
absolutely.
you certainly should see Henry Kissinger there.
Yeah.
In that.
Although this predates Henry Kissinger, which is interesting. And the other thing that's was interesting to me is that Sellos apparently extemporized much of his dialogue. I mean, in other words, he was following the script, but when he was on the phone with Dimitri, he had a little problem. Don't get excited. I mean, a lot of that dialogue, you know, was his invention, and it's just so brilliant.
I was just struck by, when I saw it the first time, which was many years ago in college, I don't recall the detail of the whole procedural piece with the military. I was really surprised how much detail he had. And he must, as you were saying, he must have done tremendous research to come up with that, because I remember more of the black humor piece and, you know, being in that time period where people really had that in the back of their minds, but the detail was what I noticed too.
It's that forward documentary, I think, that makes it incredible.
Yeah.
In that sense, it's, and the lighting, it's just, everything's just right. The camera's handheld, so it's moving, it's close.
Yeah, in the
We were talking
battles.
about confined spaces the other day.
Yeah.
Boxes, shooting in boxes and doing that well. Again, it's masterful.
He apparently insisted that the set designer for the war room put a ceiling on it because he wanted to make sure that there was that the art director or that the lighting guys could only have one source of light. And he also apparently insisted that the table in the war room be green baize, even though it was black. Somebody said, well, it's going to be black and white. We wanted green because he had the concept, or when he looked at the design, he came up with the concept of this being a huge poker table where they're playing for the future of the planet, the future of the human race. But that wonderful single source light, which is very similar to the single source light in the Killing. Here we see a lot of the downward light, particularly in the war room, and that imagery is so persistent that, and I say this, I'll explain it. But apparently when Ronald Reagan took office, he asked his chief of staff, I think it might have been Don Regan, I can't remember who his original chief of staff was, to check out the war room at the White House. And Regan came back and said, there is no war room. And Reagan said, well, I saw it in I saw it in Dr. Strangelove. And I say that not as a way to indicate that Reagan was less than sharp or was not bright or was not intelligent. I'll save that for another conversation. But to show the persistence of that imagery. That image of the war room is used so much, and you see it mimicked even in things like war games. You know,
Is that the Broderick film?
the Broderick film, right? Well, you know, I mean, it was Ken Adam, I think, the set designer for this film, that invented that image. You know, that's where it came from.
Well, they actually did say it was in the Pentagon towards the end of the movie, so.
Huh?
They actually did say it was in the Pentagon.
Well, yeah, exactly, yeah. They set it up with the opening shot where they show the Pentagon, the aerial view of the Pentagon. But you know, the visual images we see in films stay with us, you know, and they play a great, and they have an impact on us. You know, somebody pointed out the other day, I was reading an essay about what is important and what's not important, and that, you know, they're pointing out that the Beverly Hillbillies lasted 7 seasons and was incredibly popular, and yet today it's in almost no one's memory. Star Trek lasted 2 seasons, was a ratings failure, and yet, what's a cell phone but, you know, a communicator from Star Trek? I mean, and the images in Star Trek continue to persist and continue to inform the way that we live. It's that subliminal. And I think this is one of those films. People remember the war room. People remember, you know, Major Kong riding that bomb. By the way, nobody knows what the bombs had. You know, that was just a make-believe. They just created that. People remember Dr. Strangelove and his errant hand with the black glove. You know, but those, you know, Kubrick created iconic images that are with us today.
Folks, thank you very much for coming. Appreciate your attendance here. I hope you found the dialogue afterwards intriguing and informative. And we're going to do this again in about a month's time with Spike Lee. A couple of films. Tuesday and Thursday are the evenings, and it's Do the Right Thing will be the first one on a Tuesday night, and Inside Man will be the second one on a Thursday night. And the impact of Lee and what he brought to the subject.
What are some of the other directors following me?
Well, right at the moment, we're duking it out for the female director, which is going to be in March.
I hope so.